live commentary from Paris. But before we go to John Mullen, I'm just going to play a short clip of some of the highlights of what's happened in France.
Permettez-moi de dire que je suis sûr que ces dispositions réuniraient une majorité. On ne peut pas faire de paris sur l'avenir de nos retraites. Cette réforme est nécessaire. Aussi, parce que je suis attachée à notre modèle social et parce que je crois dans la démocratie parlementaire, c'est sur votre réforme, sur le texte du Parlement, fruit d'un compromis entre les deux assemblées, que je suis prête à engager ma responsabilité. J'engage la responsabilité de mon gouvernement sur l'ensemble du projet de loi.
John, how are you doing? Have you been busy this week?
Yeah, you can say that.
Now, the beginning of that clip was Parliament. That they couldn't discuss the pension reforms that Macron's trying to put through, and he had to do it by decree. Was that a really bad move on his part?
Well, he didn't have a lot of choice. You see, what happened is that he doesn't have an overall majority in Parliament. So generally, he can rely on the traditional right, 60 or so members of Parliament with the traditional right, to help him through with his laws. But this time, because the movement is so huge, that a third of the traditional right MPs got the willies and abandoned him. And the reason that they've done this is that the movement had been huge, but in particular in smaller towns, 20, 40,000 people around the country, which are traditionally conservative towns, which elect conservative MPs. Well, they had huge demonstrations, sometimes a quarter of the population, and the local MPs are just under so much pressure that even though they are traditional right and not opposed to making people work longer, they abandoned ship. And so Macron was obliged to just sign it through on a decree and hoping everything would calm down. And the opposite seems to have happened. That seems to have moved into action some people who had been resigned, but they said, well, this is impossible. We've got to do something. And so the huge day of action on Thursday was probably the biggest since the beginning of the movement. And there's also, of course, a whole series of ongoing strikes, sometimes on and off, in the docks, in electricity, the refuse collectors, and a whole series of other places.
So it's covering. I mean, we also saw firefighters going on strike, joining the protest, and police as well. So is there a chance that Macron's just going to lose control of this?
I didn't see any police come over onto our side. I know there's been some fake news going around the internet about police taking off their helmets and joining the demonstrations. It's not true.
Oh, okay. But the firefighters were. There has
been criticism from police trade unions, criticism of Macron's thing. I mean, when you engage a battle, you never know if you're going to win or not. So will Macron lose control or regain control? I don't know. I mean, I think it's important to. A lot of people seem to think that there's something special about the French, and it's all the croissant or the fact that we read our children bedtime stories with guillotines in them from very, very young. So I think it's very important to say that this has been built up over 30 years, a tradition of class struggle where there's been huge movements. Really based on a political class consciousness, that is to say, with large numbers of people striking against laws which won't affect them personally, but which they see as an attack on workers in general. And because before the huge movement in 1995, also over pensions, for years there had been not very much. We used to go to May Day demonstrations. There were 5,000 people. It's not the case that it's always been like that since 1968. It's that it's been built up over the last 20 years. And we've sometimes won, sometimes lost. I mean, we lost on the fact that you now need more stamps for a full pension than you did 20 years ago. And you now, if in the private sector, the calculation of how much pension you get is less favorable than it was 20 years ago. And on the other hand, sometimes we won. We stopped this less favorable calculation applying to the public sector. And we also, importantly, stopped the change to capital-based pensions. Pensions in France are that workers who work now have a percentage of their wage taken, which pay the pensions of the people who are retired now. It's not an individualist, be careful and think about your pension and build up capital to protect you in your own age. That's been very much rejected. And even the governments have had to abandon that idea. And they're obliged to now find ways of making workers pay while maintaining this redistributive collectivist idea of what a pension is. That is to say that workers now pay for pensioners now. The result is that pensioner poverty is much lower in France than in Britain. The number of pensioners who have to take up a part-time job to get by is very low in France. And also that there are more pensioners available for voluntary work in voluntary organizations and so on. It's just better all round, that the combativity has really been worth it, although there's a long way to go.
And the final bit of that clip that I played was Macron with an expensive watch. That's made the headlines. It's even on the BBC that was on that thing, that he took his watch off because he's embarrassed about how much it cost. At the time he was talking in an interview about how other people had to tighten their belts. Is that really bad publicity? How's it gone down in France?
Well, nobody's really that surprised. I mean, he's always been like that, so that hasn't been so big. People were delighted that King Charles is not visiting. This is because people understand it's an international humiliation for Macron. And so that's great. That's great. But I mean, the thing is, will the movement go on to win? It's difficult to say, of course. And the problem is that although 90% of non-retired people are opposed to Macron's reform, so an incredible, an unheard of level of support for a movement. Nevertheless, the national union leaderships who've been calling these days of action will not call for an indefinite general strike, and that's the big problem, because it might be that stops us from winning. Hard to say. Now, there's always something we've won, because there's no way, even supposing Macron gets away with this one, he won't be passing any more reforms over the next 4 years. He will not be able to. And so he's already shelved a horrible racist immigration law, because it will be a bit like John Major. It'll be, let's not do John Major after the poll tax thing right. Throughout Thatcher. Oh, let's not do much for a couple of years. So we've already won something, but of course what we really want to do is to win on this pensions thing, and get the push Macron really back.
So what's the next protest? When's the next big
the next big one is on Tuesday, big day of action on Tuesday. There's some things going on at the moment, but next big one on Tuesday. There's something in particular. What's been new on the last one is there were far more young people than there had been. What we had over the last month is probably maybe 20 universities out of the 100 or so really getting mobilized. And this appears to be on the rise, and that would certainly be a very helpful element if the now there were hundreds of high schools blockaded on Thursday, and we're expecting hundreds more. But if that was to really rise, the young people's implication would be great. And now, of course, young people find that retirement is a long way away, but they don't want to watch their parents just worn out by working too long. They don't want to see they don't want to find that they can't get a job because all the old people are staying on the jobs. They really understand that something can be done. And the main enemy is no doubt resignation. I mean, there is some resignation around. You hear it, but we can win this, and it really needs to go. I mean, I would have liked to have seen in front of the meeting of the national union leaders. They meet after every big demo. I would have liked to have seen a few hundred people in front of it saying general strike now, but there are remarkably few people listening to me. Can't understand why.
Well, I'll tell you what, that you're saying we should have a general strike now, and it's not good enough. I mean, look at the state we're in here. We're maybe they're saying that, I don't know if you saw at the beginning, there's an idea we'll work till 72 before we get a pension by 2050. So
yeah,
anyway,
I
thank
think
you.
it is important to clarify that maybe some people around the world think, what, 64? Well, that's not so bad. But at the same time, they're extending the number of years you need to work to get a full pension. So like right now, people have the right to get their pension at 62, but on average, they get it at 63 and a half, because they if they stop at 62, they just have too little money.
Right.
And so they have to get in some more stamps. But obviously, and this is very, Macron says it's absolutely necessary. The Committee for Pension Strategy, which was set up by Macron's prime minister, say it's not necessary. So he really is out on a limb, but really he wants to do it. He wants to. It's a symbolic thing. The unions are not the boss. I'm the boss, and that's what. So that's what. It's a bit like, you know, the miners' strike for Thatcher. It was a catastrophe for Thatcher financially, cost billions to beat the miners, but it was worth it politically for her. And so that's what they're hoping will happen here, and you know, we're hoping it won't. There's also lots of creative stuff in the movement, which is great to see. Lots of singing, lots of. Well, I really particularly like the energy workers who've taken over electricity distribution in some areas, and they're cutting off the electricity to some police stations and some conservative town halls, and putting hospitals on free electricity.
Wow.
This is in I guess a dozen towns or so. You know, it's not across the country, but it's very interesting foretaste of workers' power, if you like. If you excuse me for sounding like somebody close to the SWP, which I am. But there you go. What can you do?
All right. Well, thank you, John, and thank you for coming on, telling us all that's happening, and look forward to hearing more.